Violence has been a defining feature of American history, from the Revolution and the Indian Wars to slavery, secession, labor struggles, civil rights conflicts, and political and ethnic clashes. It should therefore come as no surprise that violence has also characterized the development of America's criminal underworld. Yet, while it is a central feature of organized crime, its role should neither be overstated nor understated. Properly understood, violence is a natural outgrowth of organized crime structure, goals, and methods. Organized crime, including La Cosa Nostra and other syndicates, remains extremely violent. The Department of Justice estimated that there were 200 gangland killings in 1979, a small fraction of the approximately 20,000 total homicides that year, but significant for the brutality and purposefulness they represented as tools of underworld control. Violence, especially murder, is used to maintain discipline, enforce rules, eliminate threats, and ensure profitability. Even among sophisticated organizations like La Cosa Nostra, which use violence more selectively to avoid unwanted law enforcement attention, well-timed murders remain an essential part of doing business. Many families experience cycles of intense violence as part of their operations. Understanding violence, its patterns, purposes, and controls, is essential to understanding organized crime itself. In its early years, organized crime relied on widespread, indiscriminate violence. Between 1919 and 1934, for example, Chicago averaged 48 gangland murders per year. Dion O'Banion, a prominent Chicago gangster, was reportedly killed simply for refusing to cancel another mobster's gambling debt. In New York, the infamous Masseria-Maranzano War, which ended with the creation of a national syndicate, cost roughly 40 Sicilian gang leaders over 3 days in 1931. Over time, however, as organized crime became more sophisticated, violence became more calculated and selective. Mob leaders realized that excessive bloodshed attracted public attention and law enforcement pressure, so they deliberately sought to limit unnecessary killings and use violence only when it served the organization's interests. La Cosa Nostra's hierarchical structure helps regulate the use of violence among its members. A strong family boss typically must approve any killing, ensuring that murder is used strategically. Disputes between soldiers are expected to be resolved peacefully, first through a capo regime captain, and if necessary, the consigliere, advisor, underboss, or boss. Failure to obey the boss's final decision can result in punishments ranging from a slap to death. Disputes between families are often resolved through a sit-down, a form of binding arbitration between bosses or consigliere. Murders within a family are carried out only if deemed necessary for the good of the organization, such as punishing informants, disobedience, or theft from the mob. Organized crime also limits violence through corruption, money, and fear. Corruption. Buying police, prosecutors, and politicians reduces the need for violence by neutralizing law enforcement threats. Money. Economic power allows the mob to co-opt criminals, businesses, and unions without resorting to force. Fear. The mob's violent reputation often makes threats alone sufficient. Victims pay extortion, customers repay loans, and competitors yield rather than risk retaliation. Organized crime uses violence strategically to solve 4 main types of problems: business violence, enforcing transactions; security violence, protecting the organization; warfare, leadership struggles; competitive violence, control of territory or markets. Business violence occurs during the normal course of illegal operations. For example, a loan shark assaulting a debtor. Because most rackets rely on ongoing relationships, violence is typically limited. Excessive brutality is bad for business. Threats and penalties, such as increased interest or seizing assets, are often enough. However, violence is more common in labor racketeering and legitimate business infiltration, where intimidation is used to extort payoffs, eliminate competitors, or enforce control. A dramatic example occurred in Kansas City, 1972 to 1977. As the mob sought to move pornography and go-go bars into the newly redeveloped River Key district, legitimate businessman Fred Bonadonna resisted. The mob retaliated violently, beating Bonadonna's son, murdering his father, bombing buildings and killing bodyguards, ultimately destroying the River Key's revitalization. Bonadonna entered the Witness Protection Program, and mobsters were later convicted of extortion. Violence is also used to protect internal security. Members who pose risks, such as the mentally unstable Willie Moretti, are killed. Informants and even their attorneys have been attacked or murdered to prevent testimony or retaliate for cooperation. For example, attorney John Fitzgerald lost a leg to a car bomb after advising a client to inform. Witness George Francorero was shot in 1981 after testifying in 2 cases. Mob hitman Joseph Barboza was murdered after agreeing to testify against New England boss Raymond Patriarca. Such violence enforces the code of silence, omerta, and discourages both insiders and victims from cooperating with authorities. Fear of retaliation is so strong that witnesses often refuse to testify, leading to drop charges, as in the case of Gary Bodak, where 15 witnesses refused to appear. This persistent danger prompted the creation of the Federal Witness Protection Program. Warfare refers to violent internal rebellions or struggles for leadership. It may stem from dissatisfaction with leadership, territorial disputes, or succession crises. Examples include the Masseria-Maranzano War, 1930s, the Gallo-Profaci War, and Bonanno War, 1960s. The assassinations of Philadelphia bosses Angelo Bruno and Philip Testa, 1980s, possibly linked to New York families. The Rochester, New York family experienced a prolonged gang war, starting in 1972, when boss Frank Valenti was ousted by Samuel Russotti and allies. After Russotti's imprisonment, acting boss Thomas Didio defied orders, enraging Russotti loyalists. A violent struggle followed, including shootings, bomb attempts and ambushes, until Russotti and others were released when their convictions were overturned. Competitive violence occurs when gangs fight for control of rackets or territory, similar to street gang conflicts. La Cosa Nostra used it to dominate gambling and loan sharking in Boston in the 1960s, killing at least 50 people in its war with Irish gangs. Newer ethnic criminal groups use the same tactics today. Nowhere is competitive violence more intense than in narcotics trafficking, especially in Miami, a hub for cocaine distribution. The rise of Colombian cartels selling directly into the US market sparked violent turf wars with American traffickers, earning Miami the nickname Cocaine Cowboy Capital. In 1979, Dade County investigated 189 homicides, with 42 related to narcotics, at least 20 directly linked to trafficking, reflecting the unprecedented scale of drug-related violence. The violence associated with organized crime is often calculated, but in places like Miami during the late 1970s, it became brazen, public, and utterly uninhibited. Rival narcotics factions, especially Colombian cartels fighting for dominance, brought levels of bloodshed rarely seen before in US cities. The Miami drug wars of the late 1970s and early 1980s illustrate the savage nature of organized crime violence. April 23, 1979. Police encountered 2 cars engaged in a machine gun battle during a high-speed chase in broad daylight. Inside one stopped vehicle, officers discovered a Colombian man hog-tied and strangled in the trunk. May 29, 1979. A Cuban drug trafficker was machine-gunned to death while driving past a suburban shopping center. Bullets ripped through nearby storefronts. July 11, 1979. 2 men drove a heavily armored war wagon van to a busy shopping mall, entered a liquor store, and unleashed over 100 rounds from machine guns, killing a Colombian drug leader and his associate, and wounding 2 bystanders. They sprayed the parking lot with more bullets as they fled to keep witnesses at bay. Such incidents were common as rival groups fought to control Miami's lucrative drug trade. Most murders went unsolved, largely because Colombian hitmen had no local roots and often fled the country before they could be identified or captured. Ironically, some evidence suggests that the presence of a powerful crime syndicate can reduce certain forms of street crime in neighborhoods where it operates. La Cosa Nostra, for example, has at times acted as an informal enforcer of order, discouraging petty crime to maintain good public relations and neighborhood support. As one law enforcement official remarked, "They keep the streets a lot safer than the cops do." However, this effect is limited. With the exception of Florida's drug-fueled violence, cities with strong organized crime groups do not have lower violent crime rates than those without. Moreover, organized crime indirectly fuels violence. Drug addiction drives thefts, assaults, and even murders by users seeking money for drugs. Impaired judgment from drug use leads to violent acts that might not otherwise occur. Youth gangs emulate the violent behavior of high-profile mobsters, contributing to urban violence. The New York City Police Department once estimated that 50% of all street crime was committed by drug addicts, a figure that highlights organized crime's indirect contribution to broader social violence. While La Cosa Nostra remains the most documented organized crime group, other criminal organizations also exhibit significant and often distinct patterns of violence. Groups like the Hells Angels, Banditos, and Pagans are notorious for their extreme violence, often targeting even law enforcement, something traditional mafia families generally avoid. Example: a pagan member who tried to leave the gang was injected with sulfuric acid, stabbed dozens of times, and shot in the head, and miraculously survived. Drug organizations use violence beyond simple turf wars. Common causes include rip-offs, stealing drugs or money without completing a deal, revenge, retaliation for theft or murder, non-delivery, failure to deliver money or narcotics, internal power struggles, informants killing suspected cooperators, security violence, witness elimination, hijacking, seizing drug shipments. A loose confederation of property criminals in the southern U.S., the Dixie Mafia, is known for violence in support of its burglaries, bank robberies, and collaborations with other organized crime groups. Based in Los Angeles, this group began by preying on fellow Israelis, but expanded into drugs, extortion, and fraud. They have been linked to dismemberment murders over drug payment disputes. California Latino groups, Chinese Tongs, Hawaiian Yakuza, and black organizations, sometimes referred to as the Black Mafia, are all involved in rackets ranging from narcotics to extortion and show varying levels of violent activity. The success of any organized crime enforcement effort ultimately depends on public support. Yet public concern about organized crime violence is often muted. Many victims are themselves criminals or individuals entangled with the mob, leading the public to view them as undeserving of sympathy. Additionally, the public's demand for illegal goods and services, such as gambling, drugs, and prostitution, fuels the mob's power and growth. This ambivalence, combined with the mob's resources and intimidation tactics, makes solving organized crime violence extremely difficult. In Miami, fewer than 40% of drug-related murders lead to arrests, and only about half of those result in convictions. In Chicago, of 999 gangland murders between 1919 and 1966, only 17 led to convictions. Violence itself makes prosecution dangerous and costly, while the mob's wealth allows it to bribe officials and undermine investigations. Together, These factors create a climate of impunity, enabling organized crime to persist and its violence to continue, largely unchecked. In 1967, the President's Crime Commission identified drugs as the third largest source of profit for organized crime after gambling and loan sharking. Much has changed since then. As Peter B. Bensinger, administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, observed, the composition of organized crime in the drug trade varies greatly by place, time, and substance. Despite these variations, drug trafficking organizations share common features. Most are sophisticated criminal syndicates, structured much like corporations and driven by profit and power. These organizations typically employ financiers, bosses, lawyers, logistics experts, exporters and importers, wholesalers and retailers. Others handle recruitment, site scouting, transportation, and the leasing of aircraft and ships. In the early 1970s, it was believed that 9 major drug networks supplied 80% of the heroin, all of the cocaine, tons of marijuana, and millions of doses of dangerous drugs entering the United States. Since then, the market has become far more fragmented and competitive. While heroin long dominated as the most profitable drug, the drug trade has diversified. Today, organizations frequently traffic in multiple drugs simultaneously, and monopolies are rare, particularly in the marijuana trade from Latin America. Even though heroin availability has declined in recent years, cocaine, marijuana, and PCP have surged, and marijuana has surpassed heroin as the most lucrative illegal drug. Each substance, however, demands its own analysis. Heroin remains the primary addictive drug in the United States. In 1974, about 450,000 addicts consumed 8 to 10 tons of heroin annually. It is also the most lethal. For much of 1965 to 1980, heroin was the leading cause of death for Americans aged 15 to 35. Initially concentrated in inner-city ghettos, heroin use spread nationwide by the early 1970s, prompting President Nixon in 1971 to label narcotics public enemy number 1. Despite efforts to curb supply, heroin remained abundant by 1980, and usage was again rising. Production is illegal worldwide except for limited medical or research purposes, and virtually all heroin entering the US is produced illicitly from opium. Most opium used in heroin is also produced illegally. The sources of opium for US-bound heroin have shifted over time. Turkey dominated production for decades. In the 1970s, production shifted to Mexico and Southeast Asia. By 1980, the Golden Crescent, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran, supplied most heroin to the US. Opium is derived from the poppy plant and valued for its morphine content. Gum extracted from the poppy pods is processed into morphine base, which is then refined into heroin, an off-white powder. Once smuggled into the US, organized crime networks dilute the heroin to 3 to 10% purity for street sales. The price skyrockets at each stage. Stage price, circa 1965. Turkish farmer, 10 kilograms opium gum, $350. Smugglers, 1 kilogram morphine base, $700. Refined in France. Per kilogram heroin, $3,500. Wholesale in New York, $18,000. And street value, diluted to 5% purity, $225,000. By the late 1970s, the street value of a kilogram exceeded $600,000. Almost all heroin entering the US is smuggled by organized criminal groups, with the US as the world's largest market due to high demand and high prices. In 1965, La Cosa Nostra, LCN, controlled 95% of US heroin trafficking. According to then US Attorney Robert M. Morgenthau, no major heroin importation occurred in New York without LCN involvement. A Corsican French network supplied LCN with Turkish opium refined in Marseille. LCN's dominance declined in the late 1960s and 1970s after. Still, LCN remained involved, as shown by the 1974 convictions of Lucchese, Boss Carmine Tramunti, and Bonanno Boss Carmine Galante, for large-scale heroin operations. By 1980, heroin trafficking was shared by many organizations. Puerto Rican and black groups controlled distribution in New York. Mexican groups imported and distributed lower-grade heroin from domestic poppy fields. President Nixon's 1971 war on drugs led to a 17-fold increase in federal narcotics spending, from $46.5 million in 1970 to $801 million in 1980. Yet by 1981, the DEA estimated that only 2 to 5% of heroin shipments were intercepted. Manhattan D. A. Morgenthau called heroin the single most frustrating problem his office faced. While heroin was no longer the top revenue generator, cocaine and marijuana sales reached $33 billion annually. Heroin sales still totaled 6.7 to 8.2 billion in 1979. The new Golden Crescent supply caught U.S. authorities off guard, and heroin remained a severe national problem, one that would persist until these new sources were disrupted and trafficking networks dismantled. Heroin, diacetyl morphine, is a semi-synthetic opiate derived from morphine, itself extracted from opium. While morphine and codeine have legitimated medical uses, heroin has none and is illegal to manufacture, import, possess, or distribute. Heroin is a central nervous system depressant. It relieves anxiety and tension, reduces hunger, sex drive, and other primary impulses, causes drowsiness and impaired concentration. Slows respiration, potentially to fatal levels in overdose. It is highly addictive. Users rapidly build tolerance and physical dependence, and withdrawal causes severe vomiting, cramps, chills, fever, and pain for 24 to 48 hours. Most American users inject heroin intravenously, mainlining for maximum effect, though it can also be smoked or snorted. Once addicted, daily use becomes essential. 1964. Average addict spent $12.50 per day, $5,000 per year. 1970. Average NYC addict used 12 bags per day, $60 per day, or $22,000 per year. The addict population grew rapidly. 1965. 52,793 known addicts. 1970. 322,000. 1974. 722,500, peak. 1980. 400,000 to 450,000 and rising. All heroin originates from the poppy plant, Papaver somniferum, which thrives in temperate climates, often where few other crops grow profitably. Early 1970s. 80% of US-bound heroin came from Turkish poppies. Cultivation. Seeds are sown in the fall, flowers bloom in spring. Pods swell with opium gum by late June or early July. Harvesting. Pods must be cut at the right moment, too early, and the gum spills too late, and it converts to codeine. Cuts must be deep enough to release gum, but not so deep that plant juices dilute it. After 10 hours, the gum thickens and is scraped off. Delays make it too hard to harvest. Yield. 20 pounds of opium gum per acre. 10,000 acres can supply 10 tons of heroin, the annual US consumption in the early 1970s. Opium gum is the only part of the poppy that traditional farmers do not use directly for themselves. In Turkey, for example, opium is used as a cooking base. Leaves are eaten in salads. Poppy seeds are baked into bread. Empty pods serve as livestock feed. Stalks are used as sealing material. Much of the world's opium is produced legally for medical purposes, but a significant share is grown illicitly, often in the same countries where legal production occurs. In 1972, for example, 2/3 of Turkish opium was sold illegally to smugglers who paid about 20% more than the government. Historically, the main sources of illicit opium entering the United States were Golden Triangle, Burma, Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand. Golden Crescent, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. In the 1960s and early 1970s, Turkey and Mexico were the principal suppliers. In 1962, Turkey produced roughly 10 metric tons of opium for the illicit market, most destined for the United States. At the same time, Mexico's production was negligible, and although the Golden Triangle produced about 1,000 metric tons, most was consumed locally. By the 1970s, better data became available. A 1972 World Opium Survey estimated global illicit production in 1971 at 990 to 1,240 metric tons. Country breakdowns were Turkey, 35 to 80 metric tons, Mexico, 10 to 20 metric tons, Golden Triangle, 700 metric tons, Afghanistan, 100 metric tons, and Pakistan, 20 to 160 metric tons. By 1975, Turkey had nearly eliminated illicit production, while Mexico became the principal US supplier with about 75 metric tons annually. Golden Triangle production rose to about 450 metric tons, Afghanistan 150, and Pakistan 200. By 1979, production patterns shifted again. Mexico dropped to 10 metric tons. Golden Triangle output fell to about 160 metric tons due to drought. Golden Crescent nations became the global leaders. Afghanistan, 300 metric tons, Pakistan, 700 metric tons, and Iran, 600 metric tons. For the illicit trade, farmers typically shape opium into circular loaves, which can be stored indefinitely until smugglers collect them. Though opium can be smoked or chewed as a mild drug, its real value lies in its morphine content. Converting opium to morphine base reduces its weight and volume by about 90%, making it easier to smuggle and store. To produce morphine base, raw opium is placed in a barrel with hot water and calcium carbonate. This breaks it down into a morphine solution and wastewater. The solution is filtered to remove impurities, leaving a dark brown morphine-based solution. Next, ammonium sulfate is added, and the mixture is ventilated. The morphine base settles at the bottom and is separated from the waste. It is then dried either outdoors or over a fire, packaged in plastic bags, and hidden for transport. The process is simple and inexpensive. Equipment costs less than $25, and it is the same regardless of where the opium is grown or processed. Turning morphine base into heroin is more complex and dangerous. The process varies by region and quality standards. French chemists in and around Marseille are renowned for producing the purest heroin. They mix morphine base with acetone and heat it to about 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees Celsius. After removing the acetone, they add carbon black to whiten the product and chloric acid to neutralize it. The product is baked, dried, and crushed multiple times until pure heroin is formed. The process involves about 17 steps and takes more than 24 hours. It is also risky. Overheating can cause explosions, and chemists must work continuously until the batch is finished. One Marseille chemist, Joseph Kazari, famously converted 17 kilograms of morphine base into 17 kilograms of heroin in a single day. In contrast, Mexican heroin production uses less precise methods, yielding heroin of lower purity. Once heroin reaches the United States, its purity is significantly reduced before street sale. By 1979, the average street-level purity was about 3.5%, ranging from 1% to 30%. Almost every person in the supply chain cuts the heroin. A 1964 estimate suggested that 1 kilogram of 80% heroin would eventually become 16 kilograms of 5% heroin. And by 1974, the BNDD estimated heroin was cut about 45 times before reaching users. Common adulterants include quinine, enhances the rush but is expensive; mannite, inert and adds bulk; milk sugar, also inert but sweet, so often avoided. Quinine has the same bitter taste as heroin, so it is commonly used to avoid detection by taste-testing addicts. Dangerous adulterants, including rat poison and battery acid, have also been found. Overly pure heroin or too much quinine can easily cause fatal overdoses. Distribution networks vary, but most follow a hierarchical structure. Importer negotiates deals and financing, typically handling 100 plus kilograms. The importer often never touches the heroin directly. Wholesaler purchases heroin from the importer in 10 to 50 kilogram quantities and resells 2 to 5 kilograms to jobbers. Jobber sells to retailers. Up to this point, the heroin remains uncut. Retailer begins adulteration. A retailer might dilute 1 kilogram of 80% heroin into 5 kilograms of 20% heroin. Mills or factories further adulterate the heroin before it reaches street-level sellers. Street wholesaler buys smaller quantities, ounces to 1/4 kilogram, and sells to local distributors. Distributor breaks down 1/8 kilogram, 4.5 ounces, into 75 bundles, each containing 25 to 32 bags of 5-grain doses. Pusher, street dealer, often an addict, sells individual 5-grain bags of 5% purity for $5 to $8 each. Most American heroin users inject the drug intravenously, mainlining for maximum effect. The preparation process is simple. Place heroin in a spoon or bottle cap and mix with water. Heat the mixture until the heroin dissolves. Filter it through cotton into an eyedropper or syringe. Inject it into a vein. Opium first entered the US with Chinese immigrants. Morphine, isolated in 1805, became widely used after the invention of the hypodermic needle, 1853. Its use exploded during the Civil War, when over 45,000 soldiers became addicted. Heroin, first synthesized in 1874, was promoted as a cure for morphine addiction and widely sold in cough medicines. It was even advertised in pharmacy journals as late as 1900. However, heroin proved more addictive than morphine, and by 1900, about 200,000 Americans, 1 in 400, were narcotics addicts. The McClellan Committee, 1967, identified several causes of early addiction: Chinese opium smoking, morphine addiction from the Civil War, invention of the hypodermic needle, ready availability of opium, morphine and heroin, use of heroin to treat morphine addiction, use of morphine to treat alcoholism, and morphine in patent medicines. The Harrison Narcotics Act, 1914, sought to control narcotics through licensing and taxation, criminalizing unauthorized possession, sale, or importation. Addiction declined significantly afterward, aided by 44 morphine clinics, 1919 to 1925, dispensing narcotics under supervision. Addict numbers fell from 36,000, 1939, to 20,000 by World War II. Systematic heroin distribution began in the 1920s, led by Jewish racketeers in New York. After violent power struggles, La Cosa Nostra, LCN, seized national control by the late 1930s. Until World War II, LCN sourced heroin from France and the near Far East. Wartime disruptions dried up these supplies, causing addiction rates to plummet. During the war, New York mobsters turned to Mexico, where opium introduced in the 1920s was primarily used by ethnic Chinese. Between 1941 and 1943, LCN smuggled Mexican opium into the US overland and refined it into heroin in New York area labs. Modern heroin trafficking resumed after World War II, with LCN firmly in control. As one Bureau of Narcotics official stated, "They had this thing sewed up." They stepped into a vacuum and took it over completely. For several years, nearly all heroin entering the US came from Italy, primarily through New York City. Charles Lucky Luciano and Sicilian mafia leaders arranged the Italian connection with American LCN families. Some heroin was legally produced in Milan and Genoa for medical use, but was stolen by Sicilian mafia members and shipped illegally to the US. In the early 1950s, the Italian government banned heroin production, forcing a major shift in the global drug trade. French Corsican syndicates quickly replaced the Sicilian mafia as the principal source of heroin for the US market. As a result, the port city of Marseille emerged as the heroin capital of the world, producing roughly 80% of the heroin bound for the United States from the early 1950s until 1972. The Corsican syndicates obtained morphine base primarily from Turkey, smuggling it through Syria and Lebanon into Marseille. There, French chemists converted the morphine base into high-purity heroin. The morphine base was often transported by French sailors working aboard ships from Beirut, Aleppo, or Istanbul. Corsican traffickers favored two major routes for getting heroin into the United States: via Sicily and Italian immigrants. Much of the heroin was routed through Sicily, where the Sicilian mafia facilitated its transport to Italian-American importers in New York. A common method involved false-bottomed trunks given to unsuspecting Italian immigrants by mafia-linked travel agencies, via North America, Montreal and Mexico City. Corsican smugglers also sent heroin via automobiles, diplomatic couriers, or airplanes to Corsican and French-Canadian associates in Montreal. When Canadian law enforcement intensified its efforts, shipments were diverted through Mexico City. Corsicans alternated between the two transshipment points throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, but all heroin eventually arrived in New York City for distribution. Montreal became a major smuggling hub immediately after World War II. A Corsican syndicate led by Antoine D'Agostino, an Algerian-born trafficker, shipped Italian heroin supplied by Charles Lucky Luciano to Vito Genovese, a powerful LCN boss in New York. After being caught selling heroin to an undercover agent in 1949, D'Agostino jumped bail and relocated operations to Mexico City. In 1953, Carmine Galante, underboss of the Bonanno crime family, formed a powerful alliance with the Italian Corsican underworld in Montreal. The following year, Galante and Montreal mobster Frank Petrula reportedly met with Luciano in Italy to negotiate increased heroin shipments. By 1956, 60% of heroin entering North America flowed through Montreal, controlled by the Corsican LCN partnership. Montreal mob boss Giuseppe Controni oversaw heroin imports from Corsican suppliers and arranged transport by car into New York. A parallel route originated in Toronto, where Corsican heroin, imported via the Sicilian mafia, was smuggled into Buffalo, Rochester, and other northeastern cities. This network was led by Stefano Magaddino, the powerful Buffalo LCN boss, and operated throughout the 1950s, often using false-bottomed trunks. Although La Cosa Nostra, LCN, dominated heroin trafficking into the United States before 1965, it did not hold a complete monopoly. Smaller groups of Black, Puerto Rican, Cuban, and Jewish traffickers controlled roughly 5% of the East Coast heroin trade. On the West Coast, the McClellan Committee found that from 1950 to 1958, the primary heroin source was Communist China, with Asian heroin handled by loosely organized groups in Los Angeles. Starting in 1949, Mexico emerged as a significant source. About 80% of the heroin smuggled through Mexico originated in Marseille and involved the Corsican LCN alliance. The remaining 20% was grown and processed in Mexico itself, supplying primarily the West Coast and replacing Asian heroin. Government efforts to disrupt heroin trafficking did not stop the flow of drugs into the United States, but did have a significant impact on La Cosa Nostra's membership and leadership. Between 1954 and 1964, 206 LCN members were convicted of narcotics violations. Among those convicted were Vito Genovese, considered the most powerful LCN boss in the country, Carmine Galante, Bonanno underboss, Natale Evola, and John Ormento, Lucchese lieutenants, and Rocco Mazze, Gambino lieutenant. One major narcotics case, which led to a 15-year sentence for Genovese, involved the smuggling of 160 kilograms of Corsican heroin through Cuba in 1954. The heroin was distributed from New York to Cleveland, Chicago, Philadelphia, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles. Although Genovese never handled the heroin himself, he was convicted as the leader of the enterprise. The McClellan Committee reported that by 1964, over 40% of the Lucchese family had been convicted of narcotics crimes. About 20% of the Gambino family and 19% of the Genovese family had narcotics convictions. These statistics demonstrated the effectiveness of government prosecutions, although the actual percentages may have been slightly overstated due to incomplete data on family membership. By 1964, heroin trafficking in the United States remained largely under LCN control, with the organization supplying 95% of the heroin entering New York City and distributing it across the East Coast, Midwest, and Southwest. The LCN received heroin from the Corsican-Sicilian partnership, importing it through New York, Montreal, Mexico City, and Miami. On the West Coast, independent groups importing Mexican-grown heroin remained dominant. At that time, heroin addiction was still largely concentrated in major urban ghettos. The Bureau of Narcotics reported 48,535 addicts as of December 31, 1963, with New York City home to over half of them. The city was also the principal base of operations for LCN heroin traffickers. From 1965 to 1972, the Corsican LCN partnership supplied roughly 80% of the heroin available in the United States. Turkish smugglers transported illicit opium through Bulgaria into Western Europe, where it was processed into heroin in laboratories near Marseille. Members of the Union Corse, the Corsican underworld, then smuggled the heroin into the US, primarily through New York City, Montreal, Mexico City, and Miami. While the majority of heroin was routed directly to New York, about 35% traveled through a South American network. A Corsican syndicate headquartered in Argentina purchased heroin from Marseille and shipped it to New York, Miami, and Mexico. Montreal continued to play an important role as a transshipment hub, though it handled less heroin than in the 1950s and early 1960s. Nicknamed the French Connection, the Corsican LCN network peaked between 1968 and 1972, supplying the US with 8 to 12 tons of heroin annually. During this period, addiction rates soared and heroin use spread beyond inner cities into the suburbs. The French Connection thrived because of the high morphine content of Turkish opium, the organized and efficient smuggling networks, the exceptionally high quality of Marseille-produced heroin. However, the trade collapsed in 1972, following Turkey's ban on opium cultivation and intensified law enforcement crackdowns in the United States, France, and South America. The dismantling of the French Connection caused a significant heroin shortage in the US. By 1975, Mexico had replaced the French Connection as the primary supplier, providing 85 to 90% of the heroin in the US. Despite occasional attempts to revive it, the French Connection never regained its former dominance after 1972. The French Connection heroin supply chain began in the poppy fields of central Anatolia, Turkey, where about 90,000 farmers cultivated opium. Each year they produced roughly 100 tons of opium gum, sold primarily to the Turkish government for legal medical use. However, about 20 to 25% of the gum was diverted to the illicit market, where smugglers paid 20% more than the official price. Yield per acre. 1 acre of poppies produced about 20 pounds of opium gum, ultimately yielding 2 pounds of heroin. U.S. demand. At the peak of the French Connection, U.S. consumption reached about 10 tons per year, the output of approximately 10,000 poppy fields. Quality. Corsican traffickers preferred Turkish opium because of its high morphine content, 9 to 14%, the highest in the world. By 1971, the global opium trade was a tightly wound machine, and the numbers told the story. A United Nations survey the following year laid it out plain. The world was swimming in the stuff. Turkey was the first stop in the pipeline. Farmers there pulled between 35 and 80 metric tons of raw opium from the ground, and almost all of it was bound for the United States, funneled through Marseille and refined into heroin by Corsican chemists before it ever touched American soil. That single route fed roughly 80% of the US market. Mexico was in the game too, though on a smaller scale. Poppy fields in Sinaloa and Durango produced 10 to 20 tons, with about 15% of it headed north. It was rougher stuff than the European product, but it kept junkies supplied when the French pipeline faltered. Half a world away, the Golden Triangle, a lawless patch where Burma, Laos and Thailand meet, was the heavyweight. It churned out close to 700 tons a year, a staggering share of the global supply. Most of it never left Southeast Asia, feeding local demand and regional markets, though a sliver, about 5%, made its way to the States. In Afghanistan, growers turned out around 100 tons, while Pakistan added anywhere from 20 to 160. Almost all of that stayed closer to home, moving into Iran or circulating locally. India, with its own 100-ton crop, kept its output largely inside its borders too. Even Eastern Europe and a few other outliers contributed another 20 to 50 tons, mostly for regional use. Put together, it was an empire of poppy and powder, stretching from the hills of Anatolia to the jungles of Southeast Asia. But for the American street addict, the line almost always traced back to one place. Turkish opium, cooked in Marseille, shipped across the Atlantic, the quiet backbone of an underworld economy worth billions. The Turkish heroin supply chain revolved around a network of farmers, transporters, collectors, patrons and smugglers. Farmers harvested and stored opium gum until approached by a transporter who delivered it to a collector. Collectors were influential figures in their communities and often operated morphine-based laboratories. They stockpiled morphine base until contacted by a patron. Patrons were the key organizers and financiers. They arranged purchases, hired smugglers, and coordinated shipments to Marseille. Patrons often worked together on deals and were wealthy businessmen owning hotels, restaurants, and nightclubs, particularly in northern, Black Sea, and southern Turkey, Syrian border. Smugglers were typically independent contractors, hired per trip and not limited to opium. Many were already part of existing smuggling networks, moving guns, cigarettes, and whiskey, long before narcotics became a major commodity. This is a business without a single head. Everyone is a chief. The narcotics business is compartmentalized. Each shipment is an individual deal, another group of people. It's almost impossible to stop the flow of morphine base from Turkey by stopping individuals. There is no single tree trunk to chop. Initially, morphine base was moved south across the Syrian border into Lebanon, but heavy Turkish enforcement there from 1959 onward shifted smuggling to the Northwest Passage through Bulgaria, 1965 to 1972. The key land route crossed the Turkish border at Kapıkule, and over 50% of morphine base bound for Marseille took this route. From Bulgaria, it was moved overland to various European transshipment points, especially Munich, before reaching Marseille. Transportation methods included automobiles, often rentals or wrecks, trucks sealed with TIR customs documents, creative concealment methods devised by smugglers. Once in Europe, customs inspections were lax, particularly compared to Bulgaria and Turkey. Overland routes were preferred because French port authorities closely inspected ships arriving from Turkey. Some traffickers used maritime drop-and-pick methods. Ships would drop waterproof bags of morphine base near the French coast, marked by buoys, and small boats would retrieve them before dawn. Payment for smugglers varied. They were either paid a percentage of profits or compensated based on distance travelled. Once the morphine base left Turkey, Corsican traffickers often assumed control of its transport, but Turkish smugglers sometimes handled deliveries all the way to Marseille. US and French officials acknowledged that if morphine base was not intercepted before leaving Turkey, stopping it became nearly impossible. Customs agencies were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of cargo and lacked sufficient manpower, making inspections perfunctory. As a result, most morphine-based shipments were never seized.